Welcome to the Art of Whiskey. I'm Patrick Dolan, your host. Today's video is about introduction to whiskey. We're not going to do a lot of drinking and tasting notes today, but we're going to work on a little bit is more about what is whiskey and why we would want to learn more about it. It's kind of an introduction video. So this is kind of just a smooth introduction to kind of what is whiskey and where we're going to go from here. So what is whiskey? Whiskey is an alcoholic beverage. It's a spirit that's at least 80 proof. And it's made from taking fermented grains, running them through a distillation process, and then aging them in charred oak barrels. But that's just the beginning of the story. There are so many different ways that pioneers in the whiskey and bourbon industry are taking this, aging different ages in the barrels, different chars in the barrels, different finished products. There's a whole new world of whiskeys that is just as varied as the world of wine. So why would people want to learn about whiskeys? Let's talk a little about that. Honestly, the main reason is it tastes great. It tastes great neat, is what we call neats when we drink it straight out of a glass, just pure bourbon or whiskey. You can also use it in cocktails like old fashions. So it has a lot of versatility in what you could use it for. There's also, like I mentioned earlier, an explosive innovation in the realm of whiskeys and bourbons. There's a lot of different finishes, whether it's an apricot barrel finish or Sauterne barrel finish or straight. There's a lot of different things going on in the world of whiskey, and people are really pushing a lot of the frontiers and expanding out with what you can do with what we thought whiskey was. So that's kind of cool. The cost range of whiskeys. Generally, I find you can find whiskeys and bourbons for under $20. Generally, those aren't real high quality though. Most I find of the really good drinking bourbons and whiskeys are typically in the $40 to $80 range. Those are things you can get like Buffalo Trace, Eagle Rare. There's many good whiskeys. Russell's is in there. You can also get some Jack Daniels in there sometimes. Another thing people like to do with whiskeys, and I kind of think this is kind of one of the unwritten rules about whiskeys, the people that really start getting into them, is this kind of a hunting game. A lot of times whiskeys are allocated or hard to find. So a lot of times people will put time and effort into sourcing where they get them, getting relationships with the people that own the liquor stores and things. And that makes a big difference on kind of the fun of the game, the fun of the hunt for people and finding a product. Also, the community for whiskey and bourbon is really interesting. I find that this community is a very diverse community. There could be people, white collar jobs, blue collar jobs. It doesn't seem to matter. Whiskey tends to bring people with a common interest together. And one thing that this group likes to do is share, whether it's sharing stories, having a lot of get-togethers to share actually the bourbons and pours they have. Most people are very friendly about that. And I guarantee if you probably look in your area, there's probably a Facebook or another group that is devoted to bourbons and whiskeys and talking about how it's in your community. The economics of whiskey is interesting. Most people don't think about that. But in 2023, there was a study done by the Distilled Spirit Council, and they found that in the United States, over $5 billion was spent on the bourbon and whiskey industry. So there's a lot of money in this market, and obviously with that much money in the market, there's a lot of people drinking this. There are several events that really put the spark into kind of the innovation and acceptance of whiskeys. The invention of the column still in 1831 was one of the big ones. That was a process where they could distill the fermented grains in such a way that they could actually start producing this. The other big thing that was a big deal for the acceptance and spread of whiskey and bourbons was back in 1880. There was some insects called phylloxera, and they were destroying and eating the roots of grapevines. And so this caused a lot of this was a serious event for the wine industry. And they had a lot of trouble with it globally. And during this time, people went and started experimenting and learning more about bourbon because their wines weren't available. So different things, especially with wine and brandy. So that was interesting. So how do distillers make it? It's a fairly easy process to distill and age bourbon and whiskey. First, you take grains such as wheat, corn, and barley are the most common ones. You mash them and crush them up and cook them. Then you ferment those. And then you take this fermented mixture and you distill it with the still I talked about earlier. There's several different kinds of process, column stills, etc. And then that takes that mixture and makes it alcohol. But the stuff that comes out of there is like a clear alcohol without much body or flavor to it. It's the aging and the blending that make a lot of what whiskey and bourbon is. And so we'll learn some more about that during these videos. So let's just get to the gist of it before we end this video. What is American whiskey? There are some very specific guidelines on what American whiskey is. So it needs to be bottled for no less than an 80 proof. Then that's 40% alcohol by volume. But it can't be more than 160 proof either. And that's like 80% alcohol by volume. So there's rules about how strong the alcohol has to be at a minimum and how strong it can be as a maximum. It also has to be aged in new charred oak barrels. That's a requirement. And when they come out of the still and they're ready to put it into a barrel, it's got to be put into the barrel at no more than 125 proof. Wait a minute, I just said they could be as high as 160 proof when you have it. That's true, but when they put it in the barrel, some of it evaporates out of the barrel and concentrates the flavor and the percent of alcohol in the actual whiskey itself. So when you put it in at, like, say 125 and you wait 5 or 10 years, what you get out of that's going to be a little bit stronger as that water evaporates. And the mash bill for an American whiskey has to be at least 51% of one of the fermented grain mashes, so corn or rye or wheat, etc. So where we take a little bit of a difference on that, let me put this one down, is when we get to bourbons. Bourbons are technically an American whiskey, but they're a subset of whiskey that has more rules. So they have a much tighter windows, I guess I would say, than whiskey rules have in the United States. So they need to be at least 51% corn. Not just any kind of grain mash. It has to be at least 51% corn. But it can be other things as well in there. And that's a lot of where some of the distillers of this kind of impart some of the flavors. How much rye are we going to use? How much barley? How much wheat? So there's different parts of what they're going to do with that. But corn generally lends to a little bit of a sweeter, more mild part to that. The other thing too to remember about this is Kentucky is definitely king here when it comes to bourbon. In 2018, granted this is before the pandemic and things may have shifted since then, 95% of all bourbon came from Kentucky. So that's kind of interesting, but there is a lot more people experimenting, and you'll find distillers of bourbons and whiskeys even in Utah, Washington, all over the place. So we talked a little bit about what is whiskey. We talked a little bit about why should we bother learning about it and some interesting facts about it. What is American whiskey and how is bourbon kind of a tighter subset of that? So all bourbons are whiskeys, but not all whiskeys are bourbons. So in the next class, things are going to get a little more exciting. This is more of a kind of a basis of what whiskey and bourbon is. But in our next video, we're going to talk a little bit more about how do we properly taste whiskey, what kind of glasses do we use to taste whiskey, how do we read a whiskey bottle? So when we grab a whiskey bottle like this, how do we read that? Because that has a lot of different nuances to how we read that, and it can help us shop better and enjoy our product a little bit better. So that's just the art of whiskey. I'm Patrick Dolan. I hope you enjoyed our introduction video to what is whiskey and why we should learn more about it, talk more about it. I'm hoping to do some more of these videos soon, and I'll see you next time.